The picnic. He was stretched out in the sun on a dune covered in marram grass, his head on his rolled-up tweed jacket, his tie in his trouser pocket, his brogues and socks neatly to one side, and his rimless spectacles perched up on his balding head. The breeze was westerly, breathing from behind him. There was a mix of scents. The grass gave off a salty, drying corn smell. But the sand that he disturbed was damp and composty. In the distance he could make out the geometry of a nuclear power station. A mile or two out from shore there was a wind farm. Behind him, on a small hill, was the medieval version of the turning white blades on the horizon, an old windmill whose peeling paint sails still turned creakily in high winds, but on a day like this were lame and unmoving. His restored 1950s Jeep stood on the track that led to where he lay. In its boot was a large ammonite he'd found on the beach that morning. He'd placed it carefully in his garden among the ferns, mosses, and horsetails, which was his shrine to a time as yet unshaped by humankind. Lying here, it was as though he was caught in a curious abatement, a wall of existence moving more slowly along the edge of time's main flow and turning round itself, dragging into its pool random symbolic evidence from his 60 years of life. To the general public of his sceptred island, he was largely anonymous. There would be no Wikipedia epitaph, no social media acknowledgement, maybe a footnote in a dry history of terraforming, or an engineering publication. He'd overseen the choice of land for the nuclear site and the depth of levelling to the correct rock strata it required, and likewise he had surveyed the sea floor to allow for the rearing heights of those turning sea towers. Being a geological engineer, he prospected and surveyed and gave a final shape to the land that underpinned these great monuments to the human thirst for energy. Not once had he doubted the value of his life's work on such projects. In fact, their contribution to people's lives engendered pride in his primary role in their construction. He had now been contracted to test for oil and gas shale, far from here, in the wilds of the borders with Scotland. Fracking was the means of extraction, but that was not his concern. From the point in his upbringing when his parents died in the rail crash, he had little time for recollection of his life before he was 16. He had focused on getting to university, graduating, seeing through an internship, and thence, via small projects, to those that changed whole landscapes. He had come and gone unseen, no target for protesting activists who daubed their indignation in lurid fluorescent paint over his company's headquarters, or besieged the directors' homes, or trolled naming and shaming company employees. His life had been one long evasion of those Luddites who could not see how their domestic bliss was being impacted by advances in energy production. He liked to spend his time during his holidays here, where he could view the giant creations he had precipitated, while allowing memories of his working life to gather, collect and uplift him, as if proclaiming to the ignorant world, yes, this invisible man, he made a difference. But it was proving increasingly insufficient for his well-being. Since he had always tamped down any thoughts of a social life in favour of a relentless work schedule, he now found himself, a year away from retirement, utterly alone with the realisation that this was going to be the way of things until he popped his brogues. He was an ageing celibate, friendless, unable to engage in small talk, and whose idea of excitement was finding a plant or a fossil, a throwback to a time before time. Although his eyes were shut, the silhouette on his lids startled him as it came to a standstill between his pink round face and the sun. "Hello, sorry to disturb you," said a cheery voice. He sat up. A smiling, plumpish woman in a Panama hat and blue and white stripy dress was peering down at him. She was carrying sandals in one hand and a beach bag in the other. "You haven't seen a dog, have you? A collie? She sometimes wanders this way." He had seen the creature, he recalled, an hour or so earlier. "Yes, she was heading that way." He pointed up the shoreline. "North, about an hour ago." "She's very independent, always going about her business." "Is she?" "Yes." Even with his rudimentary social skills, he could tell that the woman wanted to hang around. "Sit down if you want company," he blurted out. "Oh," she said, thrown by the odd abruptness of his offer. Then she smiled gratefully. "All right, why not?" She camped a yard or so away, spreading a cloth to sit on. "I have a picnic in my bag," she said. "Sandwiches and cold tea." "Ah, I have some crisps and a couple of pears. We could share." Again, the words came out inappropriately. But she was not fazed by it this time. It was as though she had quickly summed him up as ill-versed in a woman's presence. "That would be a super idea," she said. "A picnic for two is so much more congenial, is it not?" Her neatly prepared whole-grain bread, cucumber and cheese sandwiches and red currant tartlets rather overshadowed his offering. When they came to sipping green tea from her flask, she asked, "Are you on holiday?" "Yeah, I come here a lot. It's full of memories for me." "Oh?" He didn't elaborate. Instead, he asked her the same question. "Oh, I've a house here. When I retired from my job in London, I bought a log cabin, well, a bit more stately than that, on the edge of the salt marshes. Needs a paint job, but well insulated for winter. Wood stove heats the lot. Cool in the summer, small, flint-walled garden, 2 beds, well on top of mains water, generator on top of the power line. The man who owned it lived off-grid, hated what he called the power brokers." She talked fast and had a girlish giggle in her voice. He didn't know what to say. "The thing is, the house represents my redemption." "Oh." "I was international marketing manager for Zabo." She made it sound as though he must know the name, but his blank look had her clarify. "Fast clothes for fashionable females, that is, under 25. Sorry, fast?" He couldn't picture what it meant. "Dispensable. Maximum use 1 season, then throw it away. Oh, disgraceful. Didn't see the immorality of myself until the last couple of years, and there was such a hoo-ha about how companies like ours were destroying the planet. We just sorted out a scandal of child labour in Pakistan. Then we were hit by activists demanding we change the cotton production and dyeing processes. I find it increasingly difficult to sell us as a company supposedly hell-bent on sustainability." I see. He didn't really follow her logic. Then I had an epiphany. He raised an eyebrow. What would she say next? I downloaded an AI app called Chat Damascus. Amazing. Do you keep a diary? Not since I was 22 or so and left the poly. Have you still got it? Them? Well, somewhere, I suppose. Excellent. I kept all of mine. With this app, I uploaded a year's naive scribbles from when I was about that age, 22. She paused and flung her head back with a loud laugh. The app takes handwritten text and turns it into a speaking autonomous entity. Chat Damascus has gone viral. It constructs an avatar of who you were when you were young from your diary data. Can you believe it? Once it has been created, it can have a conversation with you across generations. It's spooky but fun. It even talks to you in the voice that you must have had when you were 20 or whatever. They're developing a video version of it. If you have film footage that it can source. Imagine talking face to face with your younger self. Anyway, that's for much later. This version of Chat Damascus is already able to know who you were. The more diaries you add, the more nuanced it becomes. It's autonomous, so it really learns to be who you were. It put me on the spot. What do you mean? Well, questions like, are you happy with the way things have turned out in life? I said yes, I thought so. And then my early self laughed and asked, so what has happened to my idealism? I wanted to change the world, to be good and kind. What happened? In later conversations, it asked why I never married. I had children when I wanted to, terribly. Her face crumpled. It was a shock. I realized I'd lived an unethical life in denial of everything I once desired, so I took early retirement. What? God. Really? But isn't the app just the latest gimmick, just using your data and mirroring it back in some algorithmic formula? She said sharply, it certainly isn't. It's as real as me sitting here beside you. Okay, he said, placating her. Maybe I should give it a shot. She brightened up like a cloud had passed. You will? Oh, goody. Let's meet here next week, same time, if you're still on holiday. I am. Super. They went on with the picnic, finding it easier and easier to talk with each other. She showed him a photo of her secluded house. She gave him a card with her address on it. Bella Green. He told her his name. She found him a challenge, but she was up for it. He was almost autistic in his one-track focus on work. But his shyness was appealing. As far as she could gather, he'd never had an intimate relationship. Wasn't his collection of prehistoric remains and remnants symbolic? She was sure he had locked away his heart, but this hobby pointed to some deep need. She could see herself searching the beaches and cliffs with him, helping him find his true, essential self. And he felt something similar towards her. She was a real chatterbox, but he liked it because there weren't any sudden silences. Unlike him, with his direct, convergent communication, she was a scattergun, a talking collage of sometimes totally divergent subjects. And something fizzed in him, in his chest, when she smiled at him, like a depth charge. He thought it might be nice to help her paint her house. He hoped they would become friends. Even more than that? Fearful, he quickly put the notion behind him. Safe to say, during the next 7 days, they each found the other dominating their waking thoughts. She was already ensconced in their picnic spot the following week when he arrived with food and drink he'd brought from a whole food shop in town. She was wearing a white linen dress. Her hair had been permed in tight curls and dyed light brown. Her round brown face was flushed. Her border collie was spread out in the grass, panting. He hadn't even sat down before she cried out, "I've been all hot and bothered, waiting to hear how the app went." He smiled but refused to be hurried, organising himself, taking off his shoes and socks, putting his tie in his jacket pocket, and folding it up so he could rest his head later. Then he looked at her and said, "I went back to the flat in London. There was one diary, my first year as an intern. I downloaded Chat Damascus and uploaded it." She clapped her hands. "Isn't that great? Isn't it so real? Isn't it shocking?" "You're right. It was really eerie. Not what I expected. Not formulaic at all. All that expression in my young voice. Spontaneous, questioning, commenting. It was a realistic, younger version of me. But there aren't any buts," she said indignantly. "I was actually so much like I am now then. Unlike you, I've not changed. To be honest, that young intern is even more boring than me now. He could see the future and wanted to make it happen one day, which it has. Sorry." Her face was practically tearful. She whispered, "Did your younger self want to get married one day?" He answered tonelessly, "No. There didn't seem to be anything remotely of that nature in its mind." "So you wouldn't change anything, Charles Gormley? Not the windmills, not the power station, and not the fracking in the Scottish lowlands?" "What?" he asked, taken aback. She knew all about his work. "I've been reading about you all week," she murmured, closing her eyes, "in engineering journals. I was so sad. I send donations to Extinction Rebellion, you know. I was so hoping you might have a Damascus moment with the app, like me, and so many thousands have. I hoped you'd ditch the fracking project, even make a bit of a song and dance in the media, help put an end to that appalling government policy once and for all. Then I hoped you might retire somewhere near here." The new fact about her unnerved him. She was a climate activist. He felt deeply uncomfortable, at odds with himself. He'd been thinking about her all week, picturing her like now on the dunes. He'd never had that gut-wrenching feeling of thinking about someone so much before. It was utterly destabilizing. "Sorry," he said. They finished their picnics in silence, hardly aware of what they were eating. He dressed and left her there. The next day he went back up to London. He opened his father's military trunk full of his childhood toys, schoolwork and hobbies. He hadn't looked in it for 50 years. Among the memorabilia was a notepad. It was filled with naive little poems written in his early teenage years. He uploaded it, too superstitious to read anything from it. But a scintilla of hope flickered across his thoughts. 2 days later, a parcel containing a colour chart for exterior woodwork arrived at Bella's house by the salt marshes. On its reverse side, there was the address of the sender. 2 days after that, a parcel arrived at Charles's door. In it was a perfectly preserved ammonite. So, that was the picnic. The germ of the idea came to me when I was listening to a BBC World Service Science podcast. On it, an artist was experimenting with the latest AI chat platform and having a conversation with her younger self, derived from her diaries. I suppose much of literature contains riffs on the process of redemption. We all, even in small ways, may desire at times to alter our characters, just a little bit. Maybe be a bit more outgoing, harness the tongue a fraction, be more expressive of our emotions, be able to see another's character flaws more clearly, forgive ourselves for something we have done. The purpose of a story like this one, the picnic, must say, I suppose, it's never too late. If you haven't already, please try some of the other tales on His Author's Voice, Stories with a Twist. They're grouped in playlists, so if you have a favourite genre, you may find it on my channel. You can also go to my website for written works, www.jacksanger.com. And there you'll find poetry, plays, novels, short stories, which you can download for free or you can make a donation. If you haven't already, please click the subscribe button. And that's it for now. I'll be back soon with another tale with a twist. See you then. Go in peace. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.